Join us as we delve into the life cycle assessment study for New Zealand's apple industry. Rachel Kilmister and Ian Appleton will take us through the industry's efforts to become more sustainable and engage with their members, and what other industry associations can learn from this experience. Let's get into it.
Welcome along to today's webinar. My name is Jeff Vickers. I'm Technical Director at thinkstep-anz, and I'm proud to be your host today. Today's webinar focuses on understanding the environmental performance of a whole sector, focusing on the apples and pears industry and their approach to life cycle assessment. I'm joined today by the lovely Rachel Kilmister from Zealand Apples and Pears and my colleague Ian Appleton. And today's going to be talking about a ton of apples and how we can bring life cycle assessment to that ton of apples and apply that also to other sectors. The webinar today will be run at two presentations back to back with a Q&A at the end. And so I'd like to hand over to Rachel, the R&D Manager at New Zealand Apples and Pears, to talk to us about their experience of life cycle assessment. So over to you, Rachel.
Hey, thanks, Jeff. And thank you to ThinkStep for this opportunity to present to you today. It really has been an exciting and an interesting journey that I'm really pleased to talk to you about. And just for today's presentation, I'm just going to give you an overview about our industry. I think there's probably quite a few people that might be listening that probably haven't had much to do with the apple and pear industry. And so then why would we do this? And a little bit about the process and the recommendations, but if you wanted to approach it yourself. Okay, so just first, New Zealand Apples and Pears, we are an industry body. And so we funded and owned 100% by New Zealand Apples and Pears growers. And so we do represent all of our growers, our packers and our exporters. And our growers, they pay an export levy in terms of all of the produce that they export, and that allows us to then represent them and to operate on their behalf. So up here, we really have the key areas of focus for New Zealand Apples and Pears and what our growers are asking us to do on their behalf. And so a big focus and probably the number one priority for our members is market access. And that really is about making sure that our members have the tools, the knowledge and the understanding that they can meet all of our different market access requirements and needs so that they can access all of any markets offshore and be able to get high value returns for the produce that they try to sell. Biosecurity is also really important for our members. Obviously, an incursion could have serious impacts on our ability to grow and produce produce, especially to be able to meet market access and be able to export to different countries. So it's a real high priority for our members that we represent them on. People is absolutely an important part of the industry, both for our permanent and our seasonal workforce. And we have a really strong relationship with the Pacific through our RSE scheme. Sustainability really is obviously the focus of what our LCA is about, is a real growing need for our industry. But in terms of sustainability, we're our industry body where we represent our growers and we support them in sustainability. It really is a focus on how they can meet market access needs around that. And we support Horticulture New Zealand in the more environment and domestic policy space for sustainability. Crop protection, a very important aspect. Obviously, we do use a lot of agrochemicals and other tools in terms of managing our crops to meet market access requirements. Research and development that underpins the market access, biosecurity and crop protection areas, and how we can continue to be innovative and support our members meet the needs for their market access. And then knowledge and capability is another really important part of what we do. And that's taking, I guess, the learnings and the information knowledge that we generate and how we provide it to our members in terms of tools, resources, best practice guides, extension engagement, field days or workshops. So a really important part. And then the other aspect that our members want us to be able to do for them is advocacy, so that our voice is heard in with government and we build government relations. So this is our national production data, just to give you a bit of a sense of the size of our industry. So in total, we've got about 11,000 hectares planted nationally, and that's primarily in the Hawke's Bay, about 65%, Nelson, Tasman region, there's about 25%, and a few smaller regions, which are about 3% each, and that's in Gisborne, Canterbury, and Central Otago. And we have about 288 export growers, 45 pack houses across those regions. And we really are an export-focused industry. We export 68% of our total crop, around 312,000 tonnes, and we have to be able to export because we can't sell any more than that on the domestic market, which is about currently 57,000 tonnes. And in terms of the size of our industry, we are the second largest horticulture industry after kiwi fruit. So as I mentioned, we really are an export-focused industry, and we really do think that we bat above our weight in this area, being so export-focused. 68% of the crop is exported, and we do actually export to about 80 different countries. But in terms of the global scale, we are about 0.5% of the total world's, production of apples, but we export around 4% of the total global export market. And our ability to meet all the different requirements in all the different markets, we're going to 80 different ones, and they're all quite differing in terms of what their requirements are, really does give us a competitive edge in terms of having that ability to find the markets that our fruit's eligible for in terms of its quality, its size, its residue profile, its pest profile. So we are nimble in that space and able to be able to shift and move, which gives us a real advantage there. So this slide really does represent what our role is as apples and pears for our industry. And I'm sure many of you know that the requirements and the complexity our growers are facing is just becoming more and more complex. And we're calling this the changing face of market access. And so I guess about 30, 40 years ago, the only thing that our growers were having to deal with was meeting some phytosanitary requirements, or I guess other countries' biosecurity needs. And then each decade, the complexity and the expectations of what they have to do to meet market access has increased. Everything it started with the residue requirements and grade standards, and then we're now doing assurance programs, especially for different customers around global gap, food safety, labelling and traceability. And then I guess in the last 10 years, more around the ethical trade and social practices, and sustainability really has been ramping up in the last 5 years, particularly around greenhouse gas emissions and environmental plans. And there's even more emerging on the horizons in terms of things like plastics and Indigenous practices. So in terms of this complexity and the need that growers are having to meet all of this, it's becoming really, really challenging for them. And so we see our role is that as Apples and Pears, as an industry body, we help our growers understand how they can interpret and simplify all of these requirements. And we want to be able to make it easy for them and provide the tools so that they can navigate this complexity. So I guess sustainability really does feel like the new frontier of reporting, and the requirements are evolving so quickly in a rapid rate. And I guess this image on the screen really does show it's just such a mind map in terms of what our growers are now having to navigate and be expected to report against, or what's being asked for them. And in so many different sources that they're being asked for too, and at different levels, whether it's different reporting requirements, different scopes, different methodology for reporting, different tools that they're being asked to use. Is it business level? Is it production level? Is it a board level? And then on top of that, the continuous improvement and what metrics are we actually measuring against and using and reporting against or monitoring against, and let alone even just a topic like greenhouse gas emissions. What are those metrics that we use for that? Agrochemicals, biodiversity. There's so much interpretation and different requirements out there that I guess our members are just looking to us to go, actually, how do we navigate this? What do we need to do here? And this really just does demonstrate the role of us as an industry body, how we can tease this apart and help them navigate it. So data really does tell a powerful story. And I guess that's especially when you can do it at an industry level as a collective approach. And that's what we really were looking to do with our life cycle assessment. We want to be able to collect industry level data so that we can benchmark it. We can use that to tell our story, especially around our social license to operate. And so up here, what I have is some industry data that tells another sustainability story that we've been able to tell through our collective, collection of industry level data. And that's around our use of agrochemicals over time and how we were able to change our use as we introduced integrated fruit production. So if you look up there in terms of our use, when we went and introduced integrated fruit production, we shifted the whole industry from exclusive use of toxic organophosphate compounds in the mid-90s and pretty well virtually eliminated the use of those agrochemicals to only be selective, more biological agrochemicals with a 90% reduction in the pesticide loading. And so that data is industry level data and tells a really powerful story in terms of the change and how our industry has innovated over time. And that data has also been used in terms of our customers or our different countries and how they use that data and demonstrate that actually if you select New Zealand apples, they are low risk and they're low residue. And that's what's happened there with the US consumer report in the US. So it's really powerful to be able to use the story collectively as an industry, and that's what we're looking to do with our life cycle assessment. So in terms of the process and how we went about knowing what we needed to do in terms of navigating this mind map of sustainability reporting and requirements, there were, I guess, 3 key areas that we focused on as an industry body. And the first one was identifying the need. And at the time, what we did was we workshopped with growers what it is that they were needing to do. And what we were finding at that time, there was a lot of pressures coming on industry. We had the Green Deal had been announced. We were going to have to reduce agrochemicals by 50%. We were going to have to cut, there was goals for cutting emissions. And there was also new requirements coming in around global gap reporting that we're going to have to start reporting against sustainability requirements. And we weren't really sure what it was that was going to be asked of us, but we knew that there was stuff coming. And so when we workshopped with the growers, what they identified was that we had a carbon footprint report that was produced in 2009 that they had been using and providing to their exporters. Their exporters had been providing to customers. They were asking for information on their carbon footprint, but their customers were now no longer accepting it because they said it was out of date and it was no longer fit for purpose. And so what our members asked was that they wanted to update that report. They needed more comprehensive data, quality data, and data that was benchmarked to international standards. And so that really set us on the journey of that we wanted to be able to do our full life cycle assessment. So the second part of the process, I mean, obviously before that, we engaged with ThinkStep and we understood we want to do our full life cycle assessment. This is the methodology and here's what we need to do. But then came the collecting the data part. And that really was the biggest challenge of this whole piece of work. It was when we started the life cycle assessment, we were probably at the height of the industry's profitability. We'd been growing for 10 years and we were on an upward trajectory. So being able to do something like a life cycle assessment was seemed like it was a nice need to have. But when we actually went to sit down with growers, we were at a different stage in the industry cycle. We've been through COVID and now it wasn't so profitable and people were time crunched. So we found that even though growers had been wanting to be able to provide data for the life cycle assessment, it was a huge job. And so when we sat down with them, they were not so willing to be able to do it. It became quite difficult to collect all the data that we actually had thought we'd be able to get. So this really is a first iterative process. It's something that we're going to be building on. But in terms of collecting the data, we learned a lot from that process. We learned that our growers don't collect the data that they need for this type of reporting. We learned how we might be able to help them collect the data in the right way. And some of those examples are that something as simple as how much fuel do you use? It might be collected at business level, or it might be collected not at a crop level because we have growers that have multiple crops. It might be not collected at an orchard level. So what we needed to start understanding is identifying how do we collect that type of data at the right level that is going to be needed for this type of reporting. So it was a really valuable exercise. So then the third part of the process that we also found was another challenge and something that was really important was that once we completed our life cycle assessment and we had our full 99-page report that Ian kindly reviewed for us, lots of information in there, but it was a lot to digest. And then when we needed to understand how do we share that data in a way that our members felt was appropriate, it was quite a challenge because there were a lot of concerns about how would that information be used to our competitors' advantage. So developing a comms plan was a really, really important part of that process, and how we got to where we are now with a 2-page report and a clear communication expectations around this is about the whole supply chain. It's not a number at the end. And we're comparing New Zealand apples with New Zealand apples here. So that was a really important part of the process that we went through. So in terms of recommendations on how to approach this, just building on that process, I guess the first part is actually focusing on how you help members collect the data that's appropriate for their reporting. So there's lots of different ways that they're going to have to report things going down the track. The first step here was our LCA, but it is all the same type of data. And so how do we set up systems and tools for our growers to be able to input the right data that they can use for a whole range of different reporting metrics? That would probably be the first thing. Then the second thing is that industry approach and the incentivization. What we're going to be developing out of this is some benchmarking tools for growers to be able to use. So because we have the collective data, what we were able to do with the individual growers we sat down is that we're really interested in seeing how they performed relative to everyone else. So how does an individual grower benchmark themselves against the rest of the industry and use that to identify where they can make improvements? So that we feel is a really important, powerful tool to be able to incentivize and go forward. And then the third part of it is really around the reporting tools. So we're using this LCA as a starting point, but we're using this now to leverage global gap reporting. And how do our growers use this data to report what's coming at them in terms of requirements under global gap, where they have to be able to report their greenhouse gas emissions? So we're using this data and information to be able to provide reports for that. But there'll be other needs, and the global gap really is the first, I guess, incentive in terms of how we can support industry members. And then just finally, Ian's going to go into this, so I'm just going to give the high level view of where we landed, but we were able to generate a 2-page fact sheet that our industry members can use. And that was really focused around the whole supply chain and all the different elements and hotspots that our members can influence and make a difference as if they're going to implement some continuous improvement. And it really is a benchmark. It's not a comparative study, and we're comparing New Zealand apples to apples. And this is the first iteration and something that we're going to continue to improve on down the track. But just quickly before I hand over to Ian to really go into the detail, just a big thank you to thinkstep and all of our growers, packers and exporters that have contributed to this. It's been, a really fantastic experience to go through. So over to Ian.
Thank you, Rachel. Really, really interesting insights. Head over to you, Ian. So Ian Appleton, to talk about life cycle assessment of a ton of apples, or maybe a kilogram of apples, but Ian Apple Kilogram is not a name that I could convince Ian to change his name to, but we'll work on that. All right, over to you, Ian.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Rachel. So as Jeff said, I'm Ian Appleton. I'm a sustainability specialist at thinkstep. I have a forestry operations background and also some logistics background. My role at thinkstep is to work with the primary industries across New Zealand and Australia, looking at product life cycle. In a nutshell, basically helping them to understand what's going on, what the impacts are. So what is a life cycle assessment? If we look at the life cycle assessment, the Life Cycle Association of New Zealand, the definition is an analytical tool for the systematic and quantitative evaluation of the environmental impacts of a product through all stages of its life. So life cycle assessment definition there, and life cycle assessments are governed by principles. So ISO 1440, which provides a framework in terms of inventory of inputs and outputs, an evaluation of potential environmental impacts, and an interpretation of results. So LCAs are science-based, they're structured, they're formal, and they're global. So backed by science, both in terms of how they're carried out, but also the underlying data that's brought into the assessment is structured. So there's a formal structure that is governed by standards and rules, and it's global. So it's a worldwide methodology. So why have a life cycle assessment? Basically to quantify the potential environmental impacts for a process. And so the process we were looking at with New Zealand Apples and Pears was the production, distribution, purchase, consumption, and end-of-life processes of 1 kilogram of New Zealand apples with the associated packaging. We followed that entire life cycle, the cradle to grave. We looked at the upstream, so the supply of inputs into the orchards and pack houses primarily. We looked at the core, so what would happen during the production of 1 kilogram of apples. and their packaging and handling within the orchard and pack houses. And then we looked at the downstream. So what happened once the kilogram of apples left the pack house gate and went on its journey overseas through the distribution chains and also consumption and, importantly, the end of life. And the modelling and analysis allows some granularity around this, so we can drill into where are the impacts coming from upstream, where are they coming from in the core, what part of the downstream value chain is generating big impacts. So what we did with New Zealand Apples and Pears, we looked at a 5-year study period, which was 2017 to 2021. We drew data from just about 500 hectares of orchards, over 16 orchards, 7 pack houses. There was over 100,000 tonnes of production during that period from the study orchards. As Rachel said, there was 80 markets, and we distilled everything down into the 15 key markets, which handled about 88% of export production. And the project took 18 months, and as Rachel said, most of that time was around data collection and iterations around collecting the data. So data collected, what we got, we looked at production data, so from the orchards, tonnages, the areas of the orchards, the age profiles, and the land uses that the orchards had come from and how long they were being used as orchards. Looked at the inputs such as energy, water, ag chems and fertilizers, and packaging. And just the little asterisk there notes that one of the things we found out, one of the hurdles we had to jump, was that there were 153 unique agrochemicals and fertilizers being used within our study orchards. We looked at the outputs, so how much fruit was coming out. We looked at water, waste and emissions. We looked at markets, where those markets were, what the distribution channels were. How did apples get from New Zealand to, I don't know, Cincinnati in the States? So where they were going and what was happening to them. We looked at the consumer, the end of life, the all-important last mile, where the consumption of the product happens, and we looked at transport types and distances. Plenty of great unknowns were overcome during the study. So apple packaging provided a bit of a challenge because there's lots of ways that you can package apples, and the same packaging can be used differently across exporters. So one might put 7 kilograms of apples in a package, and another exporter will put 6.5 in the same packaging. So had to work hard at working at how we can get an average packaging for that. What happens to New Zealand apples overseas? So where do they go? What distribution channels do they go down? Where does packaging, the various packaging pieces leave the system? Is there repackaging? And then the end user. So how would a consumer get their apples? How would they use them? And how would they dispose of them? And also one of the key things that we looked at were ports and international shipping, and just peeled back some of the data around that and looked at the impacts of those. So what we ended up with, so this is sort of above where Rachel was, is broken down into the journey that the apple takes, is a carbon footprint across the supply and delivery of a kilogram of New Zealand apples. So how would I see New Zealand apples using their LCA? So definitely identifying hotspots. So you can look at things like energy use or chemical use, where the environmental impacts are arising out of distribution, what is causing them at end of life. It enables an organisation to benchmark, so there can be self-benchmarking, as Rachel said. It's the first step in a process. So next time their LCA gets carried out, they can look back at this one, see where the changes are, and see how much they've improved. It can be comparative, so you can compare between sites or across the organisation, or even with different scenarios. So an LCA allows you to scenario check things. And importantly, I think the information and what's discovered from an LCA can dovetail into a management system. And certainly, a lot of data has been collected. If you don't measure it, you can't manage it. So there's a lot of knowledge and understanding now around the processes within New Zealand Apples and Pears. And as Rachel said, a calculator can be developed so individual stakeholders within the organisation can assess how they're impacting. And it can be used to plan for allocation of resources, so time and money over a budget period, for example, and information. So it allows a story to be told, whether internally or even externally, and it can be used for marketing. And it also can go to the next level where a environmental product declaration can be developed and published.
Ian, I'm
So
conscious of time. We're kind of at time. I don't know if you want to just sum up in a couple of final messages, and then maybe we can take any questions for those that can stay.
Yep, sure. So yeah, the outcome was that we were able to demonstrate to New Zealand Apples and Pears where their carbon footprint lay, what part of the journey was significant, and what were some of the areas of focus that were needed. And one of them was utilization and productivity. And yeah, across the board, there were a number of areas that New Zealand Apples and Pears identified that they wanted to focus on for further improvements. That's it, Jeff. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ian. And thanks to those of you who have managed to stay with us. If you do need to drop off, we will send out a recording of this next week. For those who can stay, please stay with us and we'll take a few of your questions. And if you can stick around, we'll try to answer them here. If you do need to go, yeah, completely understand that we've slightly over time. So feel free to jump out now if you need to. So with that in mind, I might just start getting onto the questions. So thank you both, Rachel and Ian, for your presentations. A couple of questions have come through while we've been talking. The first one comes from Ko, asking two questions for Rachel. So the first one is, how often do you plan to update the LCA analysis? And the second one is, what are your priority areas for emissions reduction? And what initiatives or actions have you put in place?
For the first one, we don't have a set time frame yet in terms of updating the LCA. What we're focusing on really is how we can start to create tools that will help streamline data so that we're actually becoming more of a warehouse for data inputs that we can then use to become more of a live continual update. And so we'll see how that lands and whether we need to actually when we need to do a more formal collection of data again. And then the second one in terms of focuses for impacts, I guess that will be up to our members a little bit. We're providing them with this information in terms of where they could make impacts themselves, and certainly things like productivity, cool stores, emissions, they certainly will make a difference. We have a project around reduction of agrochemicals and finding alternatives for agrochemicals. So there's a range of different ways that we're looking at it. But I think that's the beauty of this LCA, is that it's showing a whole range of areas that we can potentially all work to. And some of us will be able to work on some parts better than others.
Thank you. Probably quite a short question here for you, Ian, from Caroline. Which LCA tool did you use to complete the LCA?
It was LCA for Experts, which was formerly Garby.
Thank you. A question from Nick, and this could possibly go to both of you. How did you find collating data on a market like China was, where there's a significant export market there for New Zealand apples, but where distribution beyond the wholesale market is quite opaque? How did you manage that kind of final distribution aspect?
So yeah, there was a bit of literature research, and then drawing up a straw man, and then going back to New Zealand Apples and Pears, and Rachel would facilitate, I guess, a giggle test with her export stakeholders. It just sense check if we'd sort of got things right. But yeah, you're right, it's pretty opaque.
Yeah, I know personally, like dealing with other horticulture sectors, the amount of packing, repacking, all the things that can happen when you get into market can be quite extensive, and it does get very, very complicated very, very fast in terms of data collection and information. Next question is from Tim. Are there any plans for formal sort of verification or certification of the LCA or the LCA process itself for New Zealand Apples and Pears?
I think the main goal for us will be improving the quality of the data, and so focusing on that inputs and how we actually get better sources of data so that we can then build on that to get a more formal verification, I guess, of that.
Yep.
Yeah, so the life cycle assessment went through quite a rigorous internal QA process is the first thing I'd say, and the second would be that taken to the next step, we could develop EPDs for New Zealand apples, which would be independently verified and be published as such.
And for those who don't know what an EPD is, Ian, could you give a little overview?
EPD is an environmental product declaration, so it takes the footprint of the product, and carbon is only one footprint that it's included, and formalizes the presentation and publication of the results.
And is there any precedent of EPDs for other horticultural products?
There's many products in Europe, so lots of European EPDs for food and agricultural products. Not so common in New Zealand, but I'm sure that will change shortly, and we look forward to developing within that space.
Thanks. Next question is from Sky. Did plastic use and disposal on orchard come up as a consideration within the LCA?
Not so much on orchard, but as packaging it did. Orchards reported on their total wastes to recycling or to landfill. So plastics were recyclable, were captured in that. Product plastics were captured in national statistics overseas. So as plastics and packaging were captured there.
Thank you. This question from Wei, have you considered the combination of data and development analysis in LCA, which seems a promising method for evaluating environmental performance?
That might be a question for you, Jeff.
I'm not sure I know much about that, so I think we'll have to look into that one after this. But if you do want to send through some more information, Wei, please feel free to. Seems like an interesting area. I'm not sure we know enough about it to be able to comment, but thank you for the suggestion. That was the end of the questions that had come through. I did have a question for you, Rachel, which is, I was really interested in your changing face of market access slide. And there's clearly been a lot of change since the 1980s. I kind of wondered, what do you think is coming next?
Yeah, well, I think it's just ramping up more and more in the social and ethical space, and also in the environmental space. And I think with the environmental space, it'll start with one thing. At the moment, we're just reporting the greenhouse gases and the agrochemicals, but then it's how you report biodiversity and all the other, and water and all the other areas. So that will just keep increasing at the moment. So I couldn't tell you beyond that. I'm not thinking beyond that.
Good enough to worry about by the look of it. Okay, well, that was the end of the questions that we had. Appreciate we're over time, but thank you to those of you who joined us. And I really wanted to thank again our speakers, Rachel and Ian. Thank you both for your time, and thank you to the rest of you for dialing in today and listening to us. So appreciate everyone's time. Have a great afternoon. Goodbye all.
We have many more webinars on our website on a whole host of sustainability topics.